So let's look at the biblical account of the flood with Noah. A man and his sons and their wives were spared by God. It's believed, if you go back in time far enough, that the Mesopotamian region of the world is where mankind was restricted to at this point. So it would not take a global flood to wipe out all of mankind. It could be done in a localized flood, and let's take a look. So let's look at a biblical account that lines up with a timeline of science and history. So the flood. If we recall from Psalm 104 that we mentioned in the first video, right at the end, you see God set a boundary it cannot cross. Never again will the water cover the earth. So he's told us that once he created the world and the continental plates came up out of the water, never again would the water cover the mountains to the tops. So that would be an incorrect interpretation of what the flood is said to be doing. Scientists agree there's been at least one major flood in the Mesopotamian plain over the past 50,000 years. And the ice layers at the poles would also agree with this. Ancient civilizations. There's over 150 ancient civilizations that have stories about a flood. Over 85% of them discuss the human race being saved by a large vessel. Genesis chapter 8, the account of the flood. There are different words, Eretz and cosmos, representing mountains and hills, representing the earth, the universe, a part of the earth, whatever. When we look at the Hebrew and we look at the context that things are written in, we can know which derivation of these words are being discussed. Are we talking the top of a mountain? Are we talking a hill or a plateau? What are we discussing? When it comes to earth, is it the entire earth to the tops of mountains? Is it just the known earth, a region of it? What is it? So if we look at the account in Genesis chapter 8, first of all we see that in the 7th month, after the rains had stopped and waters were starting to recede, 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Not necessarily on Mount Ararat, but on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. So it came to rest on that. The mountains were now visible. There was earth that was visible. We know this. Continuing in chapter 8, verse 9. But the dove could find nowhere to perch because there was water over all the surface of the earth. Well, now, wait a minute. That's a seeming contradiction. We were just told that the mountains were now visible, so we can see part of the earth. Therefore, this section is interpreting itself. The word for earth, in this case, is not the entire earth. It would be the earth, as for example, where humans were dwelling. It's a certain part or region of the earth, not the entire earth, because we already know that some of the earth globally was already exposed. So the passage is interpreting itself. Verse 13, by the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth, from the region where people were. I would strongly suggest every church get a DVD of In the Days of Noah. Again, Reasons to Believe is an amazing organization, and Dr. Ross has put together a DVD that's really concise and has a lot of information in it. These are the dates that scientists would suggest, Christian scientists would suggest might be the best estimates of various important events. So, last ice age, we're looking at about 90,000 BC. Adam, the first human out of East Africa, out of this Mesopotamian region, maybe about 60,000 BC. There's a confidence interval here. This could be plus or minus a few thousand years. Noah, approximately 40,000 BC. If we put this into this context time-wise, science, history, Bible, they all tie together just fine. There'd be a lot of ice and snow. At this point in time, at about 40,000 BC, we're still involved with the Ice Age, so what's happened is, if you look at the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, they're dry at that point in time. The levels of water around the world are much lower than what they are today, which, by the way, would explain why you really think there's a Garden of Eden. Yes, I do. I really believe that science would suggest that out of this region of the world is where we see the trail leading back to where the first humans were. So somewhere in this area is where the first humans were. I believe that there was a Garden of Eden, and it's somewhere under the water today by today's standards. So 40 days of rain with the kind of ice melt you would get from the mountains in this region around Mesopotamia could create a huge lake. Now let's talk about the Tower of Babel. And I know some people will say, oh my goodness, you believe in a flood and you believe in the Tower of Babel? You're a goofy person. Well, let's consider this. A lot of people say that the mystique and the fable about the Tower of Babel is that they're going to build this thing to heaven so they can get to heaven. Well, what the Bible says. The Bible said they wanted to build something which would cause everybody to come to this place and be so impressed by this immense structure that they would all want to stay in this region. Now the reason that God gives in wiping out mankind is because they had become so evil. And if you look at it scientifically, if people stay in one region of the world and there's inbreeding that's going on, a bunch of people are going to go loco, and that's bad. Biologically, it is not good for people to stay in one remote region of the world and be guilty of inbreeding and everything else. He needed to get them, he commanded them to spread out. Even after Noah was done and got off the ark, God's command was, be fruitful, multiply, go into all the earth. Don't just stay here again in this region of the world. But so many men wanted to. So at this point in time, the Bible poetically talks about God confusing them, different languages and that sort of thing. I don't pretend to know how that happened, what happened or whatever, but we could be looking at different skin tones, different ethnic groups, whatever. So there was enough distrust or whatever that even though they were trying to build this structure, which would be such a beautiful thing and cause everybody to stay in this region of the world, now we start to disperse. Okay, so it seems like a crazy fable in the story, but contextually, as far as the timeline goes, this would make sense. We had land bridges that connected Asia to Australia and New Zealand. We had the land bridge connecting Asia to Alaska and North America. And it's when we got here as Europeans in 1492 or whatever, when we got here, there were already some folks here. Well, the Native Americans have been here for a long time. They came over prior to this time, about 11,000 years ago. They went across the Bering Land Strait, and they were here. And they went to different places around North America. So about 11,000 years ago, there were land bridges. Now, interestingly enough, the Bible's very accurate. It claims that the earth was divided in Peleg's time. This is Genesis 10:25. And this describes the idea that at about his time, there was enough melt and the waters of the earth rose, and now these land bridges were covered up. So now the continents were divided. The earth was divided at this point in time. So that would put Peleg at about 11,000 years. So the Bible hinted that the water levels were low and then rose to cover the land bridges. One other really important note, if anybody looks in a study Bible and looks to Genesis 11:11, when they talk about the ancestors of Noah after the flood, there's a word, Ab, it says in Abba, Father, that's used, and it can be either an ancestor or a father. Now, if we let the word be interpreted as ancestor, then we don't know how big the gaps of time are between Noah and Abraham, because there's definitely some generations that are missing in that passage. Now, some people would say, no, how do you know that? How do you know that there'd be a gap, that there'd be generations that were missing between the account going from Noah's day, which we would say is maybe 40,000 BC, to Abraham's day, which would be about 2000 BC? Well, we've said before that whenever we see a contradiction in the Bible, or seeming contradiction, it's good for us to investigate that and try to figure out what's going on. If we look in the Gospels, the two different genealogies that are given of Jesus and Joseph going back in time all the way back to Abraham, the genealogies are different. They're not the same. So some people would say, oh, there it is. There's an error in your Bible. There's a contradiction. If we investigate further, we recognize, and if we bring in some Jewish tradition, it's typical for Hebrews to jump generations and put together a list of ancestors according to a certain criteria. And if we do the math on taking generations from Joseph all the way back to Abraham, there's not enough generations listed to cover a time span of 2,000 years. And so we know then that the Bible sets a precedence, that there are skipped generations in the New Testament, otherwise the Bible would have a contradiction in it. And therefore, we can, if we go back and look at Genesis 11:11, and recognize that once again there can be skipped generations, then we realize this notion that the Bible in and of itself cannot give us a time, an exact time of Noah's existence, and it can't give us an exact time of Adam's existence. Now this also plays into the idea of a young earth and the flood. In the 15th century, there were two individuals in Britain, Ussher and Lightfoot, that thought it was possible to go back through the genealogies of Jesus, back through the genealogies from Abraham to Noah and then to Adam, and deal with how many years went by, not realizing that generations had been skipped. So when they came up with a date for the beginning of Earth at about 4004 BC, they meant well, and it's become accepted among Christians that that must be reality, that the Earth is 6,000 years old, 4000 BC. But unfortunately, though they meant well, they did not understand this notion of skipped generations. So we need science and history along with the Bible to put everything into context. So the beauty is, when you put everything into context, when you look at the last ice age, when you look at good dates for the approximate creation of Adam, when you look at the best dates available for a flood, a cataclysmic flood in the Mesopotamian region, when you look at the dates for when the water levels now rose high enough to cover land bridges, and so that the earth was divided at about 11,000 BC, and that there was a dispersion that's centered around this tower that they were building in Babel, then none of this is a fairy tale, and we don't have to have the Bible flying in the face of history and science. Everything comes perfectly together, and everything is well explained. So the Bible is not a myth. The notion of a flood is not a myth, and neither is the Tower of Babel or the dispersion of people around the planet prior to the covering of the land bridges and giving us an understanding of where Aborigines came from, where Native Americans came from, and that sort of thing. The good news is the Bible's amazing. The flood is an accurate account. We have over 150 ancient civilizations that speak of a flood and a man in a vessel. So there should be a whole lot less controversy about the flood than there is, and we as American Christians need to be less and less holding on to the tales that we were taught as kids, and more about exploring the scriptures with diligence and trying to figure out what an awesome account of history God gave us.